Before we get overly involved in our exploration of our show today, I have a quick story.
I love a story.
It's story time, boys and girls. When I went to Springfield this past summer to record our interview series with Brant Jester, Jin JX, and Eric Schrantz, if you haven't seen those, by the way, check them out. They're all very good episodes, particularly the one with Jin, as I recommended in our show a couple of weeks ago, DS Alcoda. I'd been hanging out with Eric after our interview had concluded, and I got invited to a mutual friend's house. He just bought his house and was having a barbecue or a campfire, and thought, yeah, why not? Why not see people? I don't live here anymore. And as we were sitting around the campfire and starting to throw, sticks that we found on it,
you do.
Yeah, like you do. We noticed that some of the sticks had weird patterns in them. And we didn't quite understand what had happened. And we realized relatively quickly that these patterns almost resembled a flute. And Eric proceeded to
In what way?
attempt to play a flute, in which it was a stick, and it had just holes coming out of it.
Was it hollow?
Mostly.
Okay. Interesting.
What it was termites.
Ah.
And I found one of those sticks in my yard yesterday.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Anyway, though.
Less than ideal.
Yeah, indeed. But this got me thinking. Because we know as a matter of historical fact that the oldest bone flutes that we have found are roughly 40,000 years old. But how did anyone have the idea to just take a bone, drill some holes in it, and try to make some sound? My thought on this matter was that what they were trying to do with these earliest flutes that we have was recreate the patterns of a termite-infested stick. Because think about this. It makes sense if you're walking down, if you're walking through the woods and you see a stick with some holes in it and you just ask yourself, well, what can I do with this stick? And you start blowing in it, and eventually you find out that you can make sound.
I don't know that that's necessarily the very first thing that I would think of, but I do get where you're coming from.
Right. I mean, obviously it would probably take, a while for someone to come up with that idea.
Sure.
But...
Did Eric get any sound out of the termite stick?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was, it wasn't in tune by any means.
Well, no.
But it was almost a pentatonic scale.
That's shocking. It's a miracle.
And completely true.
That's amazing.
But that's my point here.
Sure.
Because in my mind at least, there isn't much else that would make sense other than someone deciding, I'm tired of these flutes that I've been finding on the side of the road or the, prehistoric forest. I'm tired of them degrading. I'm tired of them turning into mush.
I shall make my own and it will be more permanent.
Exactly.
Sure.
So this week on In Time, a music history podcast, we are delving into the unknown. Because as it turns out...
I'm not going to sing that song because Disney will come for me, but let's all just think it together.
I don't think I know what song you're talking about.
Oh, sweetie.
Anyway.
Oh, sweetie. Hey, leave a comment on this video or send Zach an email about this song that he should know, especially now that he has a daughter. Very important.
Oh, dear. Here's the thing about human history, though. We only know maybe 10%. We definitely know about 5%, and even that can get pretty sketchy.
Of what?
Of our history.
Ah. Mm-hmm.
Because for those of you who don't know, or maybe you've forgotten, writing appears on Earth in about the year 5000 BC. It is theorized that we have been on this planet for about 100,000 years. Meaning, we don't know what we don't know.
Well, that's nearly always true.
This is true.
I've heard that before, I'm trying to recall now where I've heard it, but there are 3 categories of things. There's stuff that you know that you know. There's stuff that you know that you don't know. And there's stuff you don't know you don't know.
That sounds like a chart you made in high school.
I feel like it was in college, but yes.
This week on In Time, a music history podcast, we're going to try to fill in some of those gaps the best we know how, with rampant speculation and a good dosing of Leonard Bernstein. I'm your host, Zachary Singer.
I'm Susan Zeringer.
Welcome to the show. This is our 2nd season. So, really quickly, if you've been with us this whole time, thank you. We love you. We appreciate you. If you're just finding us, welcome.
No illegal drugs or other drugs were used in the making of this podcast.
Yeah. Are you sure?
I'm sure I didn't.
I didn't either. Okay, anyway.
Zach.
I'm a teacher, Susan. Anyway.
And?
Anyway.
What is your point?
If you are a fan of the show and haven't done so yet, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button, as well as follow us on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages, all at In Time Pod. You can find show notes for this and every show at intimepod.com, along with a donate feature where you can choose to make a one-time or many-time donation to the show to help us improve our infrastructure.
If you haven't ever checked out the show notes, you really should. I know at this point this is a thing that I say almost every week, but Zach puts a whole lot of effort into those show notes. They're not just a long list of links. It's references for where we got our information for the show. There's more information, things that we wish we could have put into the show but we couldn't. Any music that we reference in the show gets put on there.
Because ASCAP is prohibitively expensive.
It's true. It's true.
If any of you listening deal with copyright law, please reach out to us. I want to understand fair use and education purposes. Because I know there's a thing, but other people say there's not a thing. So if you're an entertainment lawyer, we especially want to hear from you.
Yeah, for sure. Also, always send us an email. But check out the show notes. They're very good, very informative. If you want to know more about practically anything that we've mentioned in the episodes, there's almost certainly more information on the show notes, so you should check them out.
All right. So, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, we really kind of only know about 5% of our human history. And even that 5% that we do know is kind of murky, especially at the beginning there. Because our modern obsession with documenting everything is just that. Modern.
Yeah, it's been sort of a brief fad a few times over the course of history, but by and large, the general rule has been, we don't care about them, they're all dead.
Well, even then, if it's been a thing in history, it's normally because that person was particularly important.
Well, no, I mean, there...
I got you.
In the Victorian era, there was, another 50 years or so when the Victorians were particularly obsessed with the Regency era, and they actually cared about looking back and finding out things about people and authors and artists who lived during that time. And then at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, everybody was like, man, screw those old people, they're all dead. We've got new cool stuff going on over here. Look at all these machines. And then we are currently in pretty deep to we care a lot about history and think it's super important. And at this point, it's probably fair to say that it's less of a fad and more of a cultural virtue at this point. But it has been sort of a fad in the past.
Okay.
But again, that's been the exception rather than the rule.
And whenever you're looking at these early records, history kind of reads more like this. 2 battles, or 2 armies, met at the pass at Thermopylae. Spartans and the Persians. All Spartans perished. Persians still lost. Very brief. Tells you what happened, but doesn't give you any color. And it's almost as if the world from this era is in black and white. And this goes really from the point in time where we start getting records to roughly the time of Alexander the Great, who it just happens to be a large enough megalomaniac that someone decided to color in the lines and then color outside the lines. when it comes to Alexander and his ego. But that's the thing. These steps, in terms of understanding our history, are progressions. And whenever you're dealing with a black and white photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, you have to kind of fill in the lines a little bit. Take, for example, and this is a much later example, Johann Sebastian Bach. One of our favorite composers here. I definitely reference him at least once every other episode.
Friend of the show, Johann Sebastian Bach.
His first biographer was a man named Nicholas Forkel, who, despite knowing 2 or 3 of Bach's sons, his biography is literally less than an inch thick.
Goodness.
Chapters are, a couple of pages, talks about mostly his jobs, has an inaccurate but fairly close representation of the entire catalog of his work.
Goodness.
Not by title, though. But he gets a lot of things wrong. Things that we only learn in retrospect hundreds of years later. And when you're reading this biography, there is a distinct lack of personality. It is very much in that same mold that I just described. Johann wanted a job. He walked 45 miles to get a job. He got that job. He worked there for 5 years and wrote this music. Then he moved on. That is essentially how the entire book reads. It is not a thrilling page-turner.
Sounds terrible.
But that's just the thing. During that period of time, despite the fact that he had access to his sons, and he could ask, what kind of man was your father? What was his favorite ale? Because we know how much he drank. What was his favorite piece that he had written? Instead, we just get cold, hard, quasi-facts.
It was before the days of having fact-checkers employed as editors.
Mm-hmm. And this problem plagues us, because as soon as we're looking around, not only do we have the lack of, say, color representations of historical figures, we also don't have a clean line of when something truly began, especially in the world of music and art. Because, like I mentioned, or at the beginning of our show here, we don't know who or why the idea to put holes in a bone flute came in. Clear it of the marrow, poke holes, blow into it. We don't know why that became a thing. Likewise, we don't know truly why there is a network of cave paintings a mile in a system of caves in I want to say a city, but in a region 500 miles away from Paris, France, that give us some of the oldest representations ever drawn by humans in the darkest place and the most resonant space in this cave network. There is no reason why these paintings should be there, but they are. And because of that, we have to make some assumptions. Maybe it was a religious site. Maybe it was somewhere they could go to allow their voices to be amplified and the music of their bone flutes and rock drums to be magnified in a pure, resonant space.
Maybe they just thought it was really cool.
That's it. We don't know. And about a few weeks after I wrote this episode, and I didn't think to put this in, they did find some recent evidence, I believe, in Spain. Or it could also have been France. It's one of those two, because they're right next to each other and they basically have the same history. I know they don't. Don't call me and tell me that. I know they don't have the same history. But they found that a lot of these paintings, the reason why some of the animals have like 6 or 8 legs is because if you move the shadow of a flame, you can create the illusion of motion.
Oh, cool.
So as it turns out,
Very
by this
cool.
theory, humans might have created motion pictures thousands of years ago.
tens of thousands of years ago, possibly hundreds of thousands of years ago. Well,
yeah, we
possibly 800.
We couldn't make concrete. We couldn't build a 2-story building. We were lucky to build a straw hut, but we could create motion pictures. The human mind,
astounding,
truly knows no bounds, which is why part of this period is so tantalizing, because if you're looking at philosophy, for example, we have little snippets of what people thought. Mm-hmm. And it turns out some of them were right. There's a group called the atomists in Greece, mm-hmm. who for thousands of years were just written off. Their idea was matter is comprised of atoms. That doesn't sound shocking or revolutionary to us because we know that's true. Yep. But they had no way of knowing it other than through their power of observation and reasonable deduction. They couldn't test it. They couldn't look at it. And then, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they were proven right. Thousands of years after they were thought to have been discredited.
Yeah, it's absolutely astounding to think. And not just to ponder the, common misconceptions about how dumb people were in the past, because that's almost never actually true the way you think it is. But, in reference to Johann Sebastian Bach's first biography, it's easy to think, that was kind of a newer idea at the time, writing a whole book about a single person's life who wasn't a saint or a religious figure or something like that,
king or queen,
or a king or a queen was, kind of a newer or at least a less common idea. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to think he just didn't know what kind of things would be interesting to read about. It's entirely possible that what he wrote was what was interesting for people to read about at the time.
Right, and now us, 300 years later, we don't get to know what Bach's favorite flavor of ice cream would have been.
Do you think they had ice cream?
I don't think it was invented until the early 19th century. I know, I'm pretty sure it's Martin Van Buren, the 8th president of the United States, favorite flavor was oyster.
Wild.
Yeah, so I think it took them a while to figure that out. If anyone's tried oyster ice cream, please don't tell me.
If anyone's tried oyster ice cream... Okay, wait, hang on, I have to tell you now.
Okay, all right.
There is an ice cream shop in Columbia, Missouri, called Lucky's Ice Cream Shop. Yeah. It's very good. They are locally famous for their, unusual flavors that they make, and also that they've got some, boozy ice creams and stuff. You can get a Guinness float
me there several years ago.
It's very good. One of my favorite flavors that they have there is a good green tea ice cream. It's not matcha, it's green tea. It's very good. Anyway, a few years ago when we had the, big bumper crop of cicadas here in the Midwest, not brewdecks, 5 years ago, something like that, they took cicada shells and removed the wings and boiled them and coated them in caramel and chocolate and put them through ice cream, and they called it Cicada Crunch ice cream, and they sold out for 2 days before the health department was whoa, we don't have any nutrition facts on cicada shells, you can't do that. They sold out. Everybody in Columbia wanted to try Cicada Crunch ice cream.
I do not know how to feel about that. Anyway.
I will posit to you that Cicada Crunch ice cream is not as weird as oyster ice cream.
Yeah, that's fair.
Gross.
But even with all of these things, there are plenty that we don't know. We have the snippets from the pre-Socratic philosophers, as it were. Mm-hmm. We know Pythagoras because, as it turns out, he's one of those people that just showed up here and there every so often who combine everything, because everything is interrelated, into music, art, science, and philosophy, and we know him because of that. But what's kind of frustrating is we don't know how language developed. We have no idea. Because that I would find to be more fascinating even than any instrument. How we discovered the bone flute, or how we decided to just punch a bunch of holes into a flute or into a bone to make a flute. Mm-hmm. I would be more interested to see how language developed, and this is the Leonard Bernstein thing, because
I've seen that lecture. I think.
Yeah, we saw it together actually several times.
Good,
but
several times.
Yeah,
you say?
Several times. Yeah, once in class and 3 times at my house. Because Eric and I started...
I was paying attention.
Oh, that's fair. Anyway, though. About 50 years ago or so, Leonard Bernstein was hosting a series of lectures at Harvard University called the Norton Lectures. This is an annual event, and I believe it still goes on to this day. But his entire purpose was to take the work of Noam Chomsky from the 1950s in linguistics and transfer the application of syntax into music. Now, Chomsky's work today, I do not believe is heavily cited, but his contributions have to be acknowledged because he is one of the earliest linguists that we have. Mm-hmm. And Bernstein's theory on this was that as a proto-hominid, just love his vocabulary, mm-hmm. the first things that would make sense for anyone to say would be the vowels.
Sure. Yeah.
With very simple consonants. Mm-hmm. And so he enacts a prehistoric child going ma, ma. And he theorizes that that simple sound becomes mother. And that's because, we're English. Well, we're Americans speaking English, which is a combination of French, German, some Celtic, really anyone that conquered England during the Middle Ages.
A very healthy dose of Latin, mm-hmm. also some Greek.
Yep. But
English
if you're
not a language, English is 4 languages in a trench coat.
This is true. Here are just some of the languages to use that ma base in some way, shape, or form. Mater in Latin. Mama, Icelandic. I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing these right. I'm sure I'm not. In Arabic. Ma or Moder in the Afrikaans. Ma or Maui in Hindi. Mater in Irish. And so on and so forth. And there are a dozen different variants. And if you change that a to an u, you get Mutter in German, which is really just an a vowel, an a, going au, u. It's very closely related. And from Mutter, you get mother. Mm-hmm. Now, he goes on like this for quite a while, and I can't say anything about the quality of Leonard Bernstein's scholarship when it comes to his ability to trace root languages. But there has to be some merit to that. And I don't want to say that it's completely right, because it's not. I'm pretty sure we know that it's not. But just that idea...
I mean, the point was that he was speculating.
Right. But just that idea in itself is inherently beautiful, but also inherently perplexing, because we don't know.
Well, but, I mean, almost all of the languages that you mentioned come from the parent language that we now refer to as Proto-Indo-European, mm-hmm. which a good third, approximately, of current existing languages on Earth can be traced back to, and the migration patterns of that language and how it split and how it's been, how it has evolved into the current languages we have today, mm-hmm. we can trace all of that. Mm-hmm. It also has been, sort of partially reconstructed. There's no way, obviously, to actually reconstruct that language, but based on, if you sort of find the least common denominator between all of the common words that we know that language had, we can sort of reconstruct what the word in that language must have probably been. But there must have been
some kind of a mother tongue somewhere.
Some kind of a mother tongue somewhere, and we can... I mean, it's been a monumental accomplishment to go back as far as Proto-Indo-European, mm-hmm. but we've only been able to go back as far as Proto-Indo-European.
Right, we don't know what was there first.
Right, and that's only for the Indo-European languages, mm-hmm. which is not, to be fair, not all of the languages in the Indo-European areas are descended from Proto-Indo-European. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of really strange ones that just seem to have been isolated for long enough, maybe, that they aren't actually related to any other language. Albanian, despite the very close proximity from Albania to Italy, Greece, and the Balkan everything. The Albanian language is like not related to any other living language. I think.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Very interesting.
This is why you're here. This is why we love Susan. She's full of things that I don't know, and I don't know what I don't know sometimes, and that was one that I definitely didn't know that I didn't know. Theme of the day. Hey. So, whenever we're looking at these things, we have to keep in mind that even with primitive humans, and as much as we like to just kind of kick them and say, oh, you guys didn't know nothing, as we've already alluded to here, there are certain things that they were onto, as I've already alluded to, that, quite frankly, we've only come back around to in the last 100 years or so. Take, for example, our good friend Pythagoras, yet again, who believed, much like an atomist, that each celestial body, in fact, every atom, produced a particular sound on account of its movement, which created a universal harmony. Now, we don't...
You're going to tell the story about how Pythagoras went crazy because of that?
Maybe in a second.
Okay, we'll get there.
But even with that idea, even if it drove him insane, which I'm dying to hear this now, that idea comes back up in about the 1600s with Johannes Kepler's version of the music of the spheres, which had already existed in the Western lexicon dating back about 300 or 400 years whenever we're talking about Ars Nova. These ideas pop up time and time again, and a lot of them are tantalizing, that they just go away and come back. But before I go too far, let's hear that story.
So if you watched our previous episode or listened to our previous episode on the Overtone series, you will know that all of the way that all of that works. And I'm not going to go over it again because we did that. But also, the circle of fifths works the same way, that it's not quite exactly mathematically perfect. In our modern tuning system, in the equal temperament that we use, we've sort of fudged it all so that it does come out perfect, so that we can do whatever we want with music. But in the purest form, if you're just looking at like what frequencies happen with strings that you're actually playing with in nature, it doesn't quite exactly work out perfectly. Like for the circle of fifths, if you continually move up a fifth and up a fifth and up a fifth and up a fifth, you should eventually come back to the same note you started from, and you don't. You actually end up just like a few cents short. And it's kind of the same thing with the Overtone series, that when you're supposed to hit the octaves, they're often not quite exactly the octaves. So because Pythagoras believed that everything in the universe made music, that was like a fundamental thing of the universe, that every heavenly body, every piece of nature had its own music, learning that music did not work out to be mathematically perfect, because again, at this time, for Pythagoras and his contemporaries, like, music was math was music, and it was all connected and related. The fact that music did not work out to be mathematically perfect meant then that the universe was inherently flawed, which was not a revelation that he handled well.
Interesting. I did not know that one either. Likewise, though, and this is in a similar vein, and I'm going to butcher this name, so if anyone here is Syrian and you can correct my pronunciation, please do so. But there's a Syrian philosopher named Iamblichus, who referred to music as musical medicine. And with that in mind, that idea spread. And I don't know if that's original to him or that's just something that he commented on himself. But the Greeks and the Egyptians built massive sound chambers that were believed with the proper resonant frequencies could in fact heal the body, which is something that we dropped somewhere along the line, only to pick back up in the 20th century under the guise of music therapy. These ideas come and go. But in the last 100 years or so, we've been finding a a lot of these ancient philosophies still have merit, if not functional use, like Stoicism. That one's come back hardcore.
Yeah. Well, we've seen, I know this is sort of like tangentially related to what you mean, but you've seen the same kind of thing in the fact that, like, we've seen some merit to medical practices that were, you know, folk medicine from thousands of years ago and have since been completely and utterly discounted just by dint of being old, and people didn't know anything about medicine 1,000 years ago, which they didn't. But
they
like,
understood something.
They're using leeches to help stimulate blood flow and reattach severed limbs and digits now.
Okay.
Bloodletting is still bad, but that one use that people were using leeches for did absolutely work, and we're doing it again.
Yeah. And so, with all this being said, we have to keep in mind that not only is this true in the realm of science and philosophy, it's also in religion. Because philosophy, religion, science, history, music, all of these things were kept together under the guise of religion for centuries. And we have two of the oldest religions around still that pull roughly to the start of when we're keeping records: the Hindus and the Jews. Both of these great religions have long histories with music and musical creation. Within the Jewish tradition itself, we have the Psalms, who were supposedly written by King David, the mythical king, or actual king, who supposedly slayed the giant Goliath, who may or may not have a pituitary tumor, which, anyway, thank you, Malcolm Gladwell, for sending me down that particular rabbit hole. Read David and Goliath. It's pretty okay.
Yeah, it's very good.
It's pretty good. It's more than okay. But within that tradition of David writing the Psalms, these are religious purposes. These are religious works, but they're also deeply personal meditations, not too dissimilar from, say, Marcus Aurelius reminding himself all the time to love his subjects. It is David reminding himself to love Yahweh. Of course, he wouldn't have said the name.
No, he would not.
And since this is a completely different topic for a completely different show, we're going to have to leave that one there, because as fascinating as Pythagoras is, we got to keep moving here.
Full of fun facts.
But we have to at least acknowledge here that even if we have the words, even if we have a sketch of something, we don't know what it would have sounded like. We really, and that is going to be the forever mystery, because we can try to recreate something, but it is going to be just that, a recreation.
And very likely a flawed one, because there's no way to confirm.
Which brings us back to the epitaph of Seculos, which originates somewhere between the years 200 and 100 BC, or 200 BC and 100 AD, which is still a decent gap of time. But in this song, we can see several different strains going at the same time. Number one, it was a man who felt to memorialize his wife in song. And he thought to put it on a stone that lasted for 1,800 years. And not only that, but he also gives us a tie-in to what was happening in the world at that time. Because music, writing, really all art form, at the end of the day, boils down to a philosophy. And during the era of Seculos, the big philosophy on the planet was Stoicism, amongst other ones. But in his area, especially in the area that we now refer to as Greece, that was a pretty big one. And as far as those philosophies go, and as far as those milestones that Seculos left us go, there's also another strain of this period here that I want to kind of just chase after, because going back to the cave paintings that we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, we recreate that time and time again. We go through these weird phases in which we have to pare things down for normally reasons of austerity. Maybe the Roman Empire collapses, maybe we decide to, build an outdoor stadium for a little bit and then build an indoor stadium again. But every time we return, we wind up recreating the same acoustic structure that was in those cave systems. There is something primal and primordial about the way that we experience the world. Because when the Gothic Europeans go about building the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe, of which the most famous is Notre Dame, they wound up recreating a thing that they had no way of knowing about. And this is why all of this is so frustrating, because we don't know what we don't know. And that's partially why I've been so scattered today, because number one, I've been teaching all day. Number two, there is just so much in this nebulous cloud of the time period that I don't know where to truly start. And my brain has a hard time settling on just one thing.
Well, sure. I mean, there are also people who have many advanced degrees in this thing we're talking about and still would tell you that they know next to nothing about it.
Mm-hmm.
It is a very, very, very deep subject. And one that is great to ponder, but not one that anyone could ever know everything about.
And so with that, rather than dragging this on any further, I want to leave us today with the lyrics themselves of the Epitaph of Seculus. Because in their sadness, there is great beauty and hope still. While you live, be happy or shine. Do not suffer anything at all. Life is short, and time demands its toil. Now, that might not seem like the happiest thing.
Well, it is an epitaph.
But at the same time, the beauty in that is that no matter what we know, no matter what we don't know, the facts of life have not truly changed in the 100,000 years of our existence as a species. We all need food. We all need love. We're all going to have to work to stay alive. And if you take nothing else from this episode, take comfort in that no matter how bad things get, we are all trying to work through this together. And maybe, just maybe, if you're having a bad day, remember that that person you bumped into the street might be having a worse one. Because we don't know where we're truly coming from whenever we see each other. And if you treat each other with just a little more kindness, maybe we can make things just a little easier. But until next week, this has been In Time, a Music History podcast. If you like what you've heard today, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like and subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a comment, either on wherever you're listening to your show or on YouTube. And recommend us to your friends. Likewise, head on over to InTimePod at intimepod.com. Check out our show notes page, make a donation, and help us bring you the program that you truly deserve as an audience. I'm Zachary Singer.
I'm Susan Zeringer.
Remember to stay in time, and we'll see you next week. In Time, a music history podcast, is a Timekeepers production and is written, recorded, edited, and produced by the hosts. Be sure to check out our social media accounts, all at InTimePod, and head on over to intimepod.com where you'll find show notes and bonus material for your entertainment and continued education. Until next week, once again, remember to stay in time.